Hi everyone, this is Jim, and welcome to the fourth quarter. Today I am going to answer the question, is the D500 still viable in 2021? Should you consider buying one? How does it stack up to newer mirrorless cameras? A brand new Nikon D500 costs between $1,300 and $1,500 in the United States. You can get a used one in excellent condition for around $750. As always, purchasing cameras is about use case. So what does it do best? The Nikon D500 is an excellent all-around camera, good for everything from portraits to landscapes. That said, it is an especially good camera for fast action, like wildlife, birds in flight, sports, and fast-moving pets. Check out some of the photos taken with the D500. The D500 is not a high megapixel camera with a 20 megapixel sensor. That means it will capture less detail than many newer and much more expensive sports and wildlife oriented cameras. For example, the Canon R5 has a 45 megapixel sensor, so captures more detail. That means higher potential image quality, and you can crop or zoom in the photo more in post-processing and still retain excellent detail. I do not view this type of camera as a direct competitor, as they are at very different price points. The D500 has a crop sensor, and many of its competitors use a larger full-frame sensor. In general, full-frame sensors provide better low-light capability, greater potential depth of field, so you can create more background blur, and a wider field of view. Crop sensor cameras like the D500 have the advantage of bringing everything closer by 50%, which is great for taking photos of faraway birds or animals. So what are the differences between current sports and wildlife oriented cameras and the D500? Currently, nearly all of those cameras are mirrorless, and mirrorless cameras have several advantages. The biggest difference between the D500 and its mirrorless competitors is that mirrorless cameras use an electronic viewfinder. This shows the photographer exactly what the sensor sees, so you can better gauge exposure. You can get extra information through an electronic viewfinder that makes it easier to compose your photo. You can review photos in the electronic viewfinder without having to look at the back screen on the camera. This can be especially useful in bright conditions. Mirrorless cameras are generally smaller and lighter. So what modern mirrorless cameras does the D500 most closely compete against? 4 come to mind: the Fuji XT3 and XT4, the Sony A6600, and the Canon R6. The Fuji and Sony models have a crop sensor like the D500. The Canon R6 uses a full-frame sensor. All of these cameras have sensors from 20 megapixel to 26 megapixel, so fairly close. We'll compare these cameras in more detail later. For now, I'll go through the pros of the Nikon D500. The autofocus system is fast, really fast. The Nikon D500 can shoot 10 frames per second with full autofocus and auto tracking capability. It can do this with the best quality image type, 14-bit uncompressed RAW. Buffer. The D500 has a large buffer. At 10 frames per second, it can fire off 79 14-bit uncompressed shots before the buffer fills and the camera slows down. These files offer the most flexibility in post-processing. If you decide to use other file sizes that are smaller, like 14-bit compressed or JPEG, the buffer size increases to 200 shots. Further, the buffer clears very quickly, especially if you are using a high-speed memory card like XQD or CF Express. That means if you do fill the buffer, it is ready to shoot at full speed again in just a few seconds. Note that the way I use the D500, usually one shot at a time or small bursts, I can't recall ever filling the buffer in a real-life shooting situation. Battery life. The battery life on this camera is great. It is rated for 1,240 shots on a battery charge and easily achieves that in real life. Excellent ergonomics, including a front dial to set aperture, a trackpad, a joystick to move the focus points around, and lots of customization. Dual card slots. The camera has one very fast XQD or CF Express card slot, while the other uses the fastest SD cards. Dual cards allow you to have a backup if you are photographing a critical event like a wedding. Weather sealing. I've used this camera in light and even medium rain without issue. Not all mirrorless competitors have this level of weather sealing. Extra reach. The crop sensor gives 1.5 times reach versus a full frame camera. That means a 500mm lens effectively becomes 750mm. This is a big advantage for wildlife, sports, and action photography like fast-moving pets. The D500 can shoot 4K video and the quality is quite good. It does have a heavy crop, however, and that crop means that you get a narrower field of view and everything looks closer and less depth of field, meaning less background blur. The optical viewfinder. Many action photographers prefer the optical viewfinder to an electronic viewfinder because there is no lag and it doesn't feel like looking into a small TV screen. Note that this is also a con, as the electronic viewfinder on mirrorless cameras have a number of advantages. Cost. This camera is one of the least expensive options, especially used. Also, it is especially cost-effective for wildlife photographers because of the inexpensive but high-quality Nikon 200 to 500mm lens. There is an excellent selection of lenses available for the Nikon for sports, wildlife, and really any other kind of photography. Okay, I've gone through a whole lot of the pros, but there are also some cons. The Nikon D500, like most of its competitors, has a crop sensor, so it has less potential image quality than its full-frame competitors. No in-body image stabilization. This means that unless the lens has built-in stabilization, you don't have any stabilization at all. Stabilization allows you to take sharp photos at lower shutter speeds. It's great for those without steady hands. The latest high-end mirrorless cameras have better, more accurate autofocus systems. For example, the Canon R6 has amazing animal eye autofocus. That means that in good light, the camera can actually focus on the eyes of a moving animal. While 10 frames per second is fast, its mirrorless competitors have even higher frames per second, allowing you more opportunity to get exactly the right shot from a burst of photos. It's loud compared to mirrorless cameras. Check out the sound this makes in high speed mode. This loud sound can actually frighten birds if you're out photographing those, and I don't think it would be a great sound to have during the middle of a wedding. Unfortunately, the Nikon D500 has very poor video autofocus. This limits the D500 as a video camera for most types of video creation. It lacks a flippy screen, so you can't see your video if you are filming yourself. This limits the use of the camera for people wanting to take videos of themselves. No electronic viewfinder. Mirrorless cameras and their electronic viewfinder allow you to view exactly what the sensor sees, meaning it is easier to see the exact exposure you will get when you take the photo. Weight. At 860 grams or 1.9 pounds, including battery, it is heavy compared to its mirrorless competitors. So, how does it fare against its competitors? We'll look at the pros and cons of each and see how the D500 stacks up. The first competitor we'll look at is the Sony A6600. Here are the pros of that camera. Very fast and accurate autofocus. It also has nice tricks like eye autofocus, and it works very well. In-body image stabilization. This allows for stabilization on any lens you can attach to the camera. It allows you to get steady shots at slower shutter speeds. It's fast, 11 frames per second with full autofocus, auto exposure. Note, this is a small thing, but at its highest speed, it takes 12-bit images versus 14-bit. This translates to a small loss of dynamic range, making it slightly less able to recover detail in post-processing. The A6600, like other mirrorless cameras, has an electronic viewfinder, meaning it has advantages like seeing very closely what the exposure will be. Advantages like focus peaking, which helps you manually focus lenses, and playback in the viewfinder instead of having to look at the rear panel. It can shoot silently with some restrictions, like a 7 frame per second maximum speed and no flash. This is a big advantage when shooting events like a wedding. It has excellent video features with 4K video at 30 frames per second and slow motion high definition video at 120 frames per second. The electronic viewfinder flips up, making it easier to take video of yourself. It's small and light, 503 grams or 1.11 pounds, including the battery. It has excellent battery life, rated for 720 shots. Finally, Sony has many excellent lens choices for all types of photography, including sports and wildlife. So what about cons? Probably the biggest one is the buffer and clearing time. The A6600 has a decent buffer of roughly 44 frames, about 4 seconds of shooting at the highest speed. Unfortunately, once the buffer fills, it takes a long time to empty. That means you are out of the action for 25 to 45 seconds, depending on the speed of your cards. Note that for many photographers, this will not be an issue, as they are not likely to fill the buffer. Ergonomics. Lack of a dedicated front dial to set aperture and no joystick to set focus points is a disadvantage. The A6600 has a convoluted menu system, and it's not accessible through the touchscreen. It does have a quick menu that you can configure to easily get to the most common settings you might want to use. It has a single card slot. That means no redundancy in case a memory card fails. This is rare, but could be an issue if you are photographing critical events like weddings. Finally, the electronic viewfinder has a relatively low resolution versus the competition. The next competitor is the Fuji XT4, and we'll go through the pros and cons of that with pros first. High frames per second shooting. It can fire 15 frames per second using the mechanical shutter and even more using the electronic shutter. It has face and eye detect autofocus. Camera modes like Sports Finder mode make it easier to track fast-moving subjects. It has in-body stabilization, helping you get sharp photos at lower shutter speeds. It has a large battery with good battery life for a mirrorless camera. It has a still movie selector, which gives you just the settings for stills or videos in the menus when you switch between them. It can shoot 4K video at 60 frames per second and 1080 video at 240 frames per second, allowing for super slow motion. It can also shoot 10-bit video, which allows for more flexibility in the footage in post-processing. So, what about the Fuji X-T4 cons? There have been many reports that the autofocus on the Fuji X-T4 has a tendency to hunt. I'm not really going to go into this issue, as Fuji is continually addressing those issues with firmware updates. Your mileage may vary. No dedicated headphone jack. When you're recording video, it is desirable to be able to monitor the audio. You can do that, but you must connect to the camera through the USB port using a dongle. Dongles are inconvenient and easy to use. The Fuji has a limited selection of long lenses for wildlife photography. The longest lens available for the system is 100 to 400. Also, there are no long prime lenses like a 500mm f4. The Fuji has limited recording times for video, especially in high-resolution modes like 4K at 60 frames per second. It overheats very quickly in those modes. What about the Fuji X-T3? Note that the Fuji X-T3 is very similar to the X-T4, so most of the pros and cons of the X-T4 apply. They use the same sensor, so image quality is the same. The biggest difference between them is the X-T4 has in-body image stabilization. Minor differences is that the X-T4 lacks the stills video switch, and the X-T3 includes a dedicated headphone jack, so you don't need to use a dongle. For purposes of this review, the X-T3 is an excellent competitor to the Nikon D500. Neither the D500 or X-T3 have in-body image stabilization, a nice feature included with its other competitors. So what about the Canon R6? Its pros include very fast and accurate autofocus, including human and animal IAF. In good light, animal IAF is able to pick up and focus on the eyes of birds, making it a great camera for wildlife photography. Class-leading in-body image stabilization, allowing you to get sharp handheld photos at very low shutter speeds. It is considerably better than its competitors. Very high frame rates, 12 frames per second using the mechanical shutter and 20 frames per second using the electronic shutter. Note that when using the electronic shutter, there are some restrictions like 12-bit files, and that the camera can slow down due to low battery life. The Canon R6 has a full-frame sensor, making it capable of very good low light performance. It's able to get clean images at higher ISOs than its competitors. If you are photographing at night, at a poorly lit wedding reception, or just before dusk or dawn, this is very helpful. Excellent ergonomics, especially for someone switching from a DSLR. 4K 60 frames per second video. Note that I have not mentioned overheating. Canon has updated the firmware in this camera so that it takes much longer to overheat, so that is unlikely to be an issue. Excellent autofocus in video. A flippy screen, making it easier to film yourself if you are doing YouTube videos or other types of vlogging. So what about cons? Price. Not only is this the most expensive camera by far in this comparison at $2,499, the lenses for the system are also quite expensive. Further, the very longest wildlife prime lenses are not yet available for this system, at least not natively. You would have to use an adapter to attach older type EFS lenses in order to get those. Note that I am not including the 600 and 800 millimeter f11 prime lenses. It's not that these lenses are not good, but that they limit you to shooting only in bright daylight. Some users will miss the top LCD panel that is normally used to display camera settings without having to look in the viewfinder or the back screen. Personally, I like having a top LCD screen. So, we have seen the pros and cons of the D500's biggest competitors. It is now time to draw some conclusions. Depending on use case, the Nikon D500 is quite viable in 2021. It is especially viable as a sports and wildlife camera. It does a great job for me as a pet photographer looking to capture fast action. It is also a great all-around camera, but its smaller sensor leaves it with less potential image quality, and it's not quite as good in low light as the full-frame Canon R6. It is also not very good if you need to use the camera extensively for video. So, would I buy a new D500 in 2021? Probably not. Mirrorless cameras have, in many ways, surpassed its capabilities. But here's something to consider. You can purchase a used Nikon D500 in excellent condition and a 200 to 500 millimeter lens for as little as $2,000. That is an incredible value, and this combination can produce stunning results. Compare that to a similar setup with the Canon R6. First, you would likely have to purchase the Canon R6 new, as it's a new camera with very few available in the used market. Remember, the R6 costs $2,499. Add a wildlife lens like the Canon 100 to 500 millimeter, which costs $2,699, and you are talking about $5,200 for a good wildlife setup. So if I needed a wildlife action camera on a budget, I would definitely consider the D500. I put a link in the description to Mark Smith's comparison video between the Nikon D500 and the Sony A9. It's very illuminating and shows just how well the D500 holds up against a very fast, very expensive, sports-oriented full-frame camera. If you found this video useful, please hit the like button, and for more content, hit the subscribe button. We'll see you in the next video.